So I find this analogy is interesting, and I don't know if it's like the limitations of thinking of trade in terms of currency. Like I mean, not trade, not economic trade, but
Yeah,
so not the trade of material values, but let's say of spiritual or intellectual values. Like,
yeah.
what do you think? Do you think what do you think are the limitations of it, if there are? And then, because the reason I bring it up, I remember I got caught up on like, well, how do you know what to repay someone? Like, let's say you're wanting to act on the principle of trade. How do you know? If someone lets you, let's say, stay at their place, like, is it enough that is the currency you're paying them with your personality, or like there's no real framework that I'm aware of on how to think about that. So I do wonder if it's like the problem is thinking about it in terms of a currency, or is that a good
I
analogy?
think the problem with that analogy is just the nature of the relationship. There's so many types of relationships that you can't phrase it in that way. That you can't find a rule of that sort,
Right.
a general principle across all people other than justice in general. I think the value of this analogy is connecting this ethics and politics. So it gives you a metaphorical connection, a literary connection, in the sense that it's a good way to transition in your mind from ethics to politics using this metaphor of currency, which is more political in nature, with ethics in terms of judgment. I think that's the value of it. Like, it's creating that connection there. It's being a focus on trade in particular, not just like, oh, exchanging love or friendship or
Right.
I don't know, whatever that might be. This
Right.
is focusing on judgment in particular, that it's important for justice to judge people in that way, specifically with terms of even with trade, like you trade with their virtues. But even that's the point of any trade, even within capitalism, that's the focus. We're trading our values, not just some material thing. So in a metaphorical sense, currency is really with virtue in a sense, that we're really judging people by their virtues and vices as
Right.
proper just as much as judging inanimate things. And it would be fraudulent to yourself to evade a judgment about their vices or to withhold admiration. It would be just as vicious because it's like an evasion, an embezzlement that she says. But she's just emphasizing the devaluation that of virtue and vice. That's the value of that metaphor,
Okay.
because you devalue the currency because you demean the basis of it. It's based on judgment. And if you get rid of judgment, you destroy your moral currency. There's no way to trade with judgment in that metaphorical sense. You can't trade virtue for virtue or value for value if there is no virtue in those people or vice to judge or anything to judge.
Right. So, okay. So I do like the analogy, but the point is to, like you said, to connect ethics and politics. By politics, you mean economics, because politics is, I
I
just think
mean,
about as the
politi-
role of functioning of government.
well, politics more broadly, as in the social interactions
Got
of
it.
people.
Okay. Okay. And then you said that there are, like, one of the issues with, let's say, trying to use this analogy to guide your thinking in day to day situations where you're exchanging, because you are exchanging. So I get that, where you're
Yes.
exchanging spiritual values, is that there are too many relationships.
Mm.
What did you mean by?
Well, in the day to day life, I think this kind of metaphor reminds you that there is a connection between trade and ethics. It's
Right.
not that you just want a thing and they exchange it. You're
Right.
actually thinking in terms of, or you ought to think in terms of vice and virtue, that trait ought to be based on judgments of others. And if you
Right.
don't judge, it's either fraudulent, like moral counterfeiting, or moral embezzlement.
Right. Okay. It would be, yeah. Well, I think this goes back to a previous question I had to you about, remember the practical applications of justice, where I discussed like, okay, in this situation, what would be an equivalent value? Like there's no answer, at least not, there's no framework or guide or any sort of guiding principles that I've found that have helped me think through that. It's all, like I said, within the
One moment,
wider.
sorry.
Okay, sure. So we were talking about the exchange of values, and then I was saying it circles back to my question about the applications of justice. And there's no answer in the, well, it's not that there's no answer. It's just that none has been provided.
About how to judge others in particular.
Not
Like
necessarily how to judge others, but how to, well, actually, maybe that's part of the answer, but, and there is some, I know there is some writing or thinking that's already been done on how to properly judge, but in terms of how do you evaluate an exchange? Like, how do I know when a friend, when a friend provides me with something,
yeah,
what's my obligation? Like, if he,
yeah,
like I
with
gave the example of, he let me,
yeah,
when I moved to Melbourne, I had to place
yeah,
to stay for like 2 weeks.
yeah, within objectivist literature, there really isn't much. Maybe some lines here and there, and that's kind of why I gave that those Aristotle passages, because that's the closest thing I can
Right.
find and think of that's out there that would provide some guidance or previously given thoughts on the
Right.
matter.
So like periods of beneficence when things are going well for you where you give, and then periods of difficulty where you receive. I think that was what I got from his.
Yeah,
Friends are good in both situations, when you're happy and when you're sad.
yeah, and also the difference, like, are they just friends? Like, oh, you go play tennis sometimes with them. It's really just
Right.
strictly transactional, and I mean
Right.
that could just be a one-to-one value exchange, or if it's a matter of pleasure, like you just sit down and listen to music together. It's
Right.
really just a matter of like you talk about music, they talk about music, just a back and forth, something of equal value, of equal relation, or of equal support. And of course, it gets more complex as it becomes a closer relationship, especially friendships of virtue, where you're really just exchanging good for good, in which case it's a more complex evaluation of understanding their
Ah,
context, their changing life, the changing support they might need. I mean, I would think of things like that more complex nature of that relationship has different demands.
I got it. That's what you meant by too many relationships. So in the case of
Yes.
a particular kind of friendship or love,
Yeah.
it's there's more to consider than you said transactional. Both, I would just refine it and say both are transactional, but one has many more, as you say, relationships or dimensions to the
Yeah.
transaction. And so yes, okay. Okay, well, it's interesting. I guess someone might throw up their hands and say, why would you want to think that much about, like, would you really want to make calculations for every relationship? But I think the goal is, to me, you want to integrate this subconsciously. And so you're by
Yeah.
default, or, automatically acting in the most virtuous way possible, right? That's the goal.
Yeah. It's not the calculation per se. It's not like you're calculating how many friendship points somebody gets. I mean, that would be utilitarianism usually, where you calculate, like, that's the idea behind it, or some theoretical number. I mean, this is more a matter of integrating those different actions and types of actions rather than strictly the calculation, because it is partly automatizing what is justice, what is the nature of living a just life, and sometimes just being just towards the person is the exchange itself.
Right.
Like, if they're virtuous and you're virtuous, the exchange is virtue for virtue. Like that is the dynamic of the friendship. That what they pay to you is you pay back through virtue.
Right.
If they're virtuous towards you, you ought to be the same towards
Right.
them, virtuous.
Right.
It's really essentially about what's the purpose of their action towards you. And if the purpose is those more basic friendships, which are fine, there's nothing wrong with those, of just purely a utilitarian thing, like you play tennis or play Counter-Strike or whatever, like that's all it is, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But those aren't that deep, so you won't have as much expectations there or requirements.
Right. Yeah.
Because the intention's just to play a game or whatever it is.
Yes. Although in all cases, I think the application of justice is beautiful. Like that example I gave of I went to the dentist and the trainee, I thought went way beyond what he needed to. I love the idea that it's you reward him by, this was my interpretation, and I don't know if it's within the broader framework. It's the attempt to apply justice, but not in any sort of objective way. The idea that it is your obligation to compliment and encourage I think that's so cool, rather than just say punish the evil. I like that a lot. So that's why I'm getting into it. I really like it.
Yes, it's more like an integration. Like justice is that kind of integration among all these various instances of exchanging value, and even like punishment or uneven things, like somebody harms another. You integrate all together as justice, as in getting what you deserve or giving what is deserved.
What do you think of the fact that in English we have one word for love, but the Greeks I know had some, like we have one word for love, and then we have like 7 different words for coffee, but the Greeks had, like 6 different words for they had different kinds of friendships and loves. What do you think that there's a poverty in our thinking in our language for that?
For emotion words, I'm not sure why.
Well, for love
even
specifically, I think.
Love, well, I think
and friendship.
I'm not sure why. I guess I know in Greek, ancient Greek in particular, it had more concrete words. It focused on concrete words more, as in like things in front of you, and compared to Latin, which is quite abstract about all its terms. And it depends on, I'm not sure why English developed that way. I think it's a lot of Latin influence on it. But then beyond that, I'm not really sure. It is strange.
Okay, let me go start with a question so it guides what we go through. Okay, so I've got a question about what she calls the professional cannibals and the men making apologies, so we can discuss some examples of that. And I was thinking, anyway, I'll let you read the passage and I'll read it with you, and then we can go to discuss.
Just funny term. Professional cannibal, that's very vivid.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was wanting to think about this more concretely. So I've tried to interpret it, and he's speaking in this paragraph. He speaks to the people who they're trying to live by this morality which tells them they're corrupt and evil at base, and they're not able to fully eliminate this thing that they now hold as a guilty secret. The fact of their selfishness of wanting something for themselves materially. And so those people are the people like, do you remember what his name, something Stoddard, who built the Stoddard Temple? He was like traveling the world, and he was this rich man who retired, and he was traveling the world to go to all these temples to find like healing or the truth, or I don't know, something like that. He was just traveling to all these temples and different churches, and trying to find maybe some kind of serenity. And then he donated his money to build the temple. And
Yeah.
so I thought that as an example of someone like that, who's like, you're functioning, but you feel very guilty about functioning. And especially if you function well, I don't know if Bill Gates is an example, but you could probably find more, right, of people who like, I don't know what Bill Gates is motivated by, so it's harder to say, but
Yeah.
there's a sense of like you've had all this material success and then you feel guilty about it. So that's who she's talking about, right?
I, I think she's not quite talking about that. I mean, that is something she talks about, but not in this passage, I don't think. So I am the man. Okay, John Galt's that heroic being. So got that in my mind. They didn't fight for him. These people tried to destroy him. They were not able to destroy Galt. And they're now hiding Galt. I think literally in the plot of the story, like they were hiding him away, or where they were hiding as your guilt.
Well, not in this one. He's still in this thing. This is when he gives a speech, and he's I think he's doing it from. He hasn't been caught yet in this thing.
And it was. Spending your life in apologies. What is she hiding? What are they hiding as the guilty secret? That construction confused me a bit. And are now hiding as your guilty secret.
Maybe I should have given more context. I think this was in reference to the people who are standing at the deathbed of their own grave. Like they're still alive though. They're the kind of people he can speak to, but they're not fully alive, right? That was the point. That morality wise, they're like conflicted, so they're not fully alive. They're trying to give in fully to this morality, but they can't, so they feel a guilty secret.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But then I know it's probably pretty difficult to just
the guilty secret is that you still long to say what I'm saying. That's their secret, that secretly they really do want what John Galt is saying. Secretly they do, but they are merely apologizing to the cannibals. The sanction of the victim. They're like, thank you, do it, but secretly they don't want it. They're just they're sanctioning the victim. That's what it is. But the people who did sanction it and saying, but I am the voice you wanted to hear, is what he's saying.
Right.
And the cannibals would be every person cannibal.
So the
any of those people. Yeah, the moochers, the ones who explicitly want that destruction, the ones who, well, like Jim Taggart. I mean, they specifically want that destruction.
Okay. So it's not strictly like religious leaders or philosophers.
No, I don't think so. I think he means like professional cannibal, like who are the ones eating the good? Who are the ones destroying the good?
Right.
Who are the people destroying those that they depend on?
Right. So that could include
cannibal.
They're
eating their own.
Well, I would say like, because I read professional as someone who makes it as full, like, you know, the philosopher, the author, the priest, the rabbi, whoever who does that. And then people like you know, his brother, I forgot his brother, Philip, Hank Reardon's brother, Philip, who like just lives off him basically.
I think it would include those people, but also like politicians, because they're the ones like professional. They make it a living to destroy the good, to make it a living to prey off of the good, of the virtuous. They're preying off of other men, and it's cannibals. They're eating other men. They're destroying them by the most vicious way possible. Not just only are they killing others, but something more visceral, something deeper than that, like a hatred of man, even, is kind of what that symbol represents, I think. To say cannibal is like a hatred of man, not just of an individual or being evil to destruction, but seeing man himself as evil.
Do you think that, so one of the difficulties I have, and it's something I still think about, is when you try and identify the essence of something, especially of someone who is mixed,
Yes.
you have to you have to, like, there are different tasks. So one is obviously understanding how, going through some process of concretizing how something that is a feature that does not seem concretely that significant in a person is what matters, like going through a process of trying to understand that. But then the other is when you're analyzing an actual person, it's you can't look at there's like a need we have to analyze it in essentials but ignore the non-essentials, which is difficult. Like, take for example, maybe I'll give an example because I don't know how clear what I just said was. So if you watch a video of Eichmann, on which the whole court trial is recorded, you're somewhat familiar with Eichmann.
Yes.
Yeah, if you look at him, there's nothing you can really say about, oh, this, you just look at him and you're like, oh, this is a normal person, he's thinking, he's fine. You can't really say he's evil. There's no like monster there. I feel like sometimes the expectation is that you see a monster but you don't. And
Yeah.
so there is something, anyway. I don't know, I need to untangle my thoughts, I think, before I give you a good question. But yeah, there's something here about, like, if you just coast on what you see and like what you feel, you can't identify the essence of someone, because everyone has, in order for someone to be alive, they need virtue to some extent, right?
Yeah.
And
To some extent.
and so it's impossible to just analyze a person and whether or not he is as she says, a professional cannibal, purely on the basis of what they look like and what you feel in terms of first impressions. Because, like, even Eichmann is carrying, maybe a lot of virtues from his youth, but that's not his essential or a defining feature. And so, anyway, there's something here for me. Like, just by looking at someone, I can't say it. The characters in Atlas Shrugged, it's easier to do it with them, but in real life, I don't know.
I would be careful about the essential of an individual, because sometimes Rand really just uses essential in terms of concepts,
Right,
not for particulars.
right,
Like every tree, every table falls under one concept table,
yeah,
but any particular table, you don't say what's the essential of the table I'm eating at for dinner, like of that particular table. You don't say what's the essential for that. You say this is the concept table refers to tables like this, and the essential of the concept is XYZ or whatever it is.
right,
So I don't think you can just take an individual person or any proper noun, say like the Eiffel Tower, and say this is the essential of it. So I'm not sure if you really could say that what's the essential of your personhood or personal identity
right,
in that sense, but you could say what's essential in general to one's sense of life or personality. But you couldn't say what's the essential to, say, Jonathan or Lewis. Like, what's the essential of me? Well, I'm a particular, so I can't really integrate in that sense. But I certainly could say my sense of life seems to be integrated around so and so ideas. Might be able to say that. And you could say overall somebody's virtuous or not, or you could say overall that their characteristics fall under this concept, which holds as the essential XYZ. Like, what is the essential of virtue? And you say, does this person follow that essential? Are they consistently rational? And all those things you might say no. So they might not say they are consistently rational, but they sometimes follow the essentials of rationality, or sometimes follow the essentials of virtue. And ahead.
What about a book though? Like, couldn't you say a book has a specific concrete book has some essential thing that differentiates it from every other book?
Um, Not an essential per se. Might say the theme of the
Right.
book or plot or whatever, things like that, which I mean, it falls under the concept plot. And you say what the particular plot is. And just by being a particular, you can say that's what differentiates it. But it's a particular, you don't need any concept for that because that thing itself is all you need to know. There's a difference.
The I remember in the Art of Thinking lecture, he did give examples of how to find essentials in concretes, but it's still confusing because, like you say, well, there's this to consider, right? If you're saying an essential is from your perspective, given your level of knowledge, what is the characteristic that is responsible for most other characteristics about the person? Then if I look at let's say a murderer who murders very little, but he's still a murderer. Or a serial killer. It's not like, he doesn't do it all the time. Most of the time he's eating, he's going out, he's doing other stuff. But actually, maybe that's not a good example because I don't have a real world example that I can actually analyze and I'm just making stuff up. But what I was trying to get at was you can have someone who does something bad very little, but then if you look at what is defining him in terms of the rest of his characteristics, then I don't know if it would be murder because it can't it just something evil be some very small isolated thing in a person? I don't know. I need concrete examples to think about this properly and not waste time. But you
I'm
get what
just
I'm
going
saying.
off. Yeah, I do. I think just what I was going off of was strictly speaking when Rand mentioned Naito. I think about proper nouns, not really
Right.
mentioned Eiffel Tower for something and saying it wasn't really something like no definition or no essential or something like that. But
Right.
that's all I was saying, that we can't necessarily call these essentials in the same way that we think about concepts, because concepts are supposed to capture multiple instances of some type of object. Well,
Right.
here we're talking about an individual. Maybe
Right.
there's essential in the sense of what is characteristic of their personality or characteristic of their way of functioning. We could maybe call it that, and that would be fair, I think.
Okay. I think I need to explore this later more. I'm not as clear
Yeah.
on it. Let me
But
know
yeah,
if I drop. Yeah, go on.
I noticed that question from you in different ways several times. So, that is a tough one. I think I heard Rand say something about that. I'll give you a link later. She said something about that topic.
Well, I remember in an essay or a speech that Leonard Peikoff gave, which was my 30 years with Ayn Rand, he talked about how he went to her house and he watched it. There was some streaker on a TV show who went through. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, actually.
I'll tell you. Yeah. So there was a streaker on some well-known TV show who just like ran through the TV show, and the whole point of the TV show was that it was supposed to be some kind of glamorous rewards TV show, and everyone was dressed really nicely. And she asked him what it is, and he's like, "Oh, it's just a hooligan or something." And then she explained that the essence of it was nihilism, like the essence motivating him was nihilism. So I think I remember one example of where she's going through and trying to identify the essence of an actual concrete event or person.
Mm,
And, but I need to think about it
yeah.
more because there's some problems with it as well.
Yeah.
Okay. This is about setting a value. So like, I'm just thinking about this. Like if someone wants to set a value, like they say, I want to become this kind of person, so I need to cultivate this habit. Like maybe I can think of a more specific
Yeah.
example, but all right, let's say someone wants to say, they want to tell themselves like, I want to be someone who's more physically fit and exercises more. I want that to be my value. Like in the beginning, there's no feeling really about that value, right? Like whatever it is you want to pursue. I don't know, you say to yourself, I want to be a short story writer, I don't know if you
Sure.
necessarily start with like this unbounded love for short story writing as a value. It's like in the beginning,
Mhm.
there's nothing, right? In the beginning, there's just the
Yeah,
conscious choice. And it's only later that there's emotion. Do you think I'm thinking about that right?
I think usually that's the case. It might be different for things like foods, but if it's thing abstract things or objects like a bicycle, or say you wanted to be a writer, I mean, yeah, it would start out usually as something of a blank, emotionally,
Right.
that is.
Right.
There's no content there to be emotional about other than there's a choice to move towards it. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, in a basic sense, it's still a value, but it doesn't have much in the hierarchy, I guess. There isn't much power to it, I would describe it as.
Okay. So then I am thinking about that. Right. It's just the only consideration would then be if you want to, I don't know if the expression is good, but if you want to set a value or value something, then the question would be not so much how do I feel about it specifically, like how strong is my feeling towards it, but more so how does this value integrate with everything else, including my personality, temperament, and other interests.
Yeah,
And then if it integrates, like if you consciously go, oh, this seems to integrate, then the process is to pursue it. And the feeling is supposed to deepen after a period of time.
I would expect so,
Yeah.
based on the idea that when Rand believes that emotions are really the consequence of conscious evaluations of objects in the world. That if their emotions are a consequence of that, they should develop the more you are acting with regard to those
Right.
objects or seeking them or noticing them. It should grow correspondingly.
Well, this goes back to what Aristotle was saying, right? About the, what was it, like effort or energy invested or pain? Like the mother loves, he said them, I don't know if this is true,
Yeah,
but he said the mother loves her child more because she is
yeah,
the
it's
one
like yeah,
who's,
that metaphor. Yeah,
yeah. Okay.
same idea.
I'm going to skip that one because I've discussed that kind of stuff with you. Okay. So my question is about identifying this terror behind denouncement of an error, but I'll let you read it and then we can discuss.
Okay.
So, by the way, I just noticed uh, how this analogy of investing in counterfeit securities is another
Mm-hmm.
tie-in or integration to politics, as you pointed out before, of
Yeah, I think
morality.
it's yeah that wider integration, not with just. I think it's implicit that there's a wider thing to consider, which is politics here,
So, what
which
do
is
you
a good way
think?
to write.
Yeah, it is. Now I'm seeing it now. I didn't make like I knew I thought it was cool, but I didn't think about it. Oh, okay. There's a clear attempt here to integrate politics, economics, and then morality with these kind of analogies. But yeah, that's cool. So with this, like if someone is tied up in with a particular morality, do you think that the terror or what she describes as terror behind denouncing it, which I can kind of see, by the way, like as an example, someone who's committed to being a follower of God and religious, religious Jew or Christian or whatever, and then at age 50, the idea of denouncing that is the terror
Mhm.
behind that. What is it? Is it that you're wrong, or that you have to change your life, or like what's your take on the terror behind? Or in this case, she talks about the mystic unselfishness.
That feeling of wasted time, I think it's self-terrifying that you wasted 40 years of your life and now you realize it. It's like too much to bear. Like you're not going to admit it, or it's almost just so painful that it would be scary. Like there's a psychological pain to it, I would think.
Right.
And that's, I think it would be terrifying. I would be terrified if that were the case. Like if what I knew now was just all wrong, I was doing it wrong forever, it would be painful, like psychologically painful to just change it or to admit it even.
Oh, you know what?
That's
This also ties into what Aristotle was saying, because what do you remember the phrasing? Because
no.
morality that is like an unselfish morality, or a morality that is against your nature, makes you suffer, right? If you attempt to follow it.
Yeah, he says things like that. Yeah.
And well, no, he didn't say that. I'm just saying a morality that is, let's say, a false morality, or a morality that is against your nature, makes you suffer. The more you attempt
Yeah.
to follow it, the more you suffer, right?
Yeah, that's what I meant. He says something like it. Like,
Oh,
I
he
know not
does. Okay.
exactly, but things like that. Yeah.
I was bringing that up as a separate point, but okay, so he says that
Yeah.
too. But then so then the whole idea is that actually in following that morality, you're investing more. It's more of a value, as he says, as Aristotle says, you've suffered for it.
Yes, I would say so.
And then so in a sense, your love of it has grown, according to him.
Like a twisted love, but a tainted love, as you could say. Like the
Right,
love of the unselfish, which
right.
is damaging. But yes.
Okay. So it's there's that, which is you do value it
Yeah.
because you've invested a lot of pain into it.
Yes.
You've watered it with a jug that has pain written on it. And
Yeah.
now you're told to give it up. And so in a sense, you value it. But then there's also that aspect that I think you pointed out, like it's harder to reverse from, say, a mysticism that believes in an afterworld into one that doesn't, than anything else. Because like you said, the whole idea of wasting time is it's irredeemable.
Yeah. I think this is a version of the, oh, this is more profound, but this other thing with the sunk cost fallacy. Like if you watch an hour of a bad movie and there's 30 minutes left, it's like you spent too much time on it to go back and just admit you made a bad decision, just leave. You spent waste 30 more minutes watching a terrible movie. I mean, that's not very profound, but it's a common bias people have. And even anybody could do that easily. But think of it on a more grand scale. Like you spent 50 years thinking a certain way, thinking it's right, and you're investing time, thought into it. And now suddenly you got to change. Like the possibility of change is just so great that you can't get yourself to just say, oh, it's wrong. I'll just cut my losses. No, people often just continue what they're doing for whatever reason, but they continue with it, whether it's easier or they don't admit they're wrong or it's not less painful.
What would you say then is the object of the terror, the actual object of it? Of just simply being wrong without being able to reduce that further, or what, or wasting time, or wasting life? I don't know.
Wasting life, I think, in this case, since we're focused on self-esteem, like I think Ramsey was saying, suggesting implicitly that the fear, the object of the terror is that you wasted your life, not just like you wasted some time, a few hours, but on a more profound scale, you wasted life. And that's itself is the waste of that life is terrifying. It's almost like death. Like death can be scary, but this is almost the next level below. Like if you waste your life, that's almost as good as being as dying or having some amount of like getting hurt or something, like some
I,
profound injury.
I wonder if it's actually scarier than death, because I remember reading into, like, I read, there's a guy called Irvin Yalom. He's a psychotherapist, and
Yeah.
he's an existential psychotherapist, and he writes a lot about death, and he speaks to people a lot about death. And he said that he observed those who most fear death. I've seen this elsewhere, generally people who have a lot of regrets, or like don't feel like they've lived.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, maybe this is actually even a bigger terror of not having, maybe that's what it is, not having lived.
I think so.
or hurting yourself or something. Okay. All right. Let me cross that.
Oh, before I forget, like when you
Yes.
interpret Rand for things like, which is like the witch doctor or Attila or say like professional cannibals,
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember, at least when interpreting those sort of things, it always has a Nietzschean feel to it, because Nietzsche used those character terms like he characterizes people in terms of these types or
Ah,
characters.
cool. Right.
Like when we talk about Apollo and Dionysus, like he characterizes ideas in those characters, and he might simplify it. They might seem simple, but then when you analyze how they act, it's never quite so simple. Like we went over that essay about Nietzsche, like how we took apart the different concepts. It wasn't merely the Dionysian man does this, but there's different ways to use what he does, or different ways to integrate those things, or different ways that ends up in reality. Remember that?
Right. I
Yeah.
think that my take is that there's quite a, I think there's, you can interpret it without context, but that's no good, because I think there's like a huge amount of analysis that maybe these abstractions draw upon, and if you
Yes,
don't have it, I think it makes it difficult to properly
it is
interpret
true.
what, if I had like a huge survey, if I did a huge study and survey of all philosophers and history, I would come to this with a very different, I'd really be able to analyze it properly, right?
Yeah. I that kind of thinking is like kind of Nietzschean, and I think Rand does get that from Nietzsche a bit, but does her own take on it. But
Right.
you can even think of John Galt as a Nietzschean type of character. You can't see him as simply the virtuous man. And it is true he's virtuous, but what dynamic does that mean for his life? Is not merely he's like a caricature. No, he's a full type of being in that Nietzschean way, that there's depth to it. There's variety and nuance to who this person is. They're not woodblock cutouts, as some people think they are. I mean, they're really deep representations of
I
different
th-
individuals or something to that effect.
okay. I didn't know that was uh I guess so. There's the wait. Well, let's separate this. So there's this Nietzschean aspect, which I'm not fully clear on, but that's probably because I just haven't read enough
Yeah,
Nietzsche.
it's
But then, I when people say that her characters are wooden, usually I just take it as they didn't they really don't like the book, and so
yeah,
or sometimes not that they really don't like the book, they're genuinely bored. But I kind of see their point, but differently. Like, I don't see her characters as wooden. I do see them as deep, and in some cases nuanced, like
yeah,
Hank Reardon. But
yeah,
Jim Taggart, I don't know how nuanced. Jim Taggart is like as
true.
consistent as you can get for someone who's evasive. But that I
Yeah,
do see them as deep, and I see them as representing abstraction. So I might see myself in lots of, at least for me, I can sometimes see myself in lots of different characters as opposed to just one.
yeah,
And so I kind of understand when people say they're wooden, I think that sometimes they're getting at the fact that they're trying to represent abstractions as perfectly as you can.
yeah,
Like in the case of Taggart, you can't fully, he'd be dead if he was fully evil all the time. But
yeah.
he's consistent, right? He's fairly consistent
About that, yeah.
about
Consistent of
being evasive,
his vice. Yeah,
right? And so I do get that. I think I get that criticism when people say
yeah,
she's wooden, but I also see them as
yeah,
deep. And yeah,
yeah.
that's my take
I
on it.
know many people won't mention that Nietzschean connection. I think partly it's that they haven't read enough Nietzsche, if they don't notice, or if
Probably the
upon
latter.
mentioning it. Yeah, but he does have that type of strain. I know Rand read him plenty, so I'd be surprised if she wasn't influenced in some way by its style, even if obviously not his content, but the style. Yeah, like there's these characters, these representations. They could say even concretizations of abstractions, and that's why we could condense so much abstract stuff into like quick sentences. Rand can sort of do that too. She could condense like few sentences into something both powerful and true and impactful in your life and everything at
Right.
once
Right.
by concretizing these grand abstractions into things that you can hold in your mind and concentrate on, focus on, think about.
Right. Yeah, you actually brought this up as well in relation to we were discussing academic language,
Yeah.
and you said that Nietzsche
Yeah.
discusses that specifically and striving instead for a kind of dense clarity. But
Yes.
do you, I need to read him. I can't read Aristotle and him at the same. It's too much.
Yeah.
It's quite difficult.
I
I'll
know.
get to it eventually.
Yeah.
I'll get to it eventually, but I need to
Yeah.
do one thing at a time. But
Yeah.
is one of the connections as well the kinds of characters? Like her characters are like, I'm trying to think of a description. You know, like you might describe someone as having like a taut body and a kind of not a frown, but the face of like a Viking conqueror or
Well, I
a
mean more thematic characters, but sometimes
oh, okay.
like a virtuous man's like a mane, like a lion,
Yes. Yeah.
describing
Okay.
like a master morality,
Right. I get it.
which
But
she doesn't
it
support it, but it's like it is what he calls part of that description of it. Not literally, but like metaphorically. That's what it is
but
to him.
but it makes sense because her morality is so evil, and I still to some extent feel this, and I want to analyze it further, but evil is often in the culture is perceived as some kind of powerful force, right? It's like it
Yeah.
is that Viking conqueror. It's not Eichmann, who's this small bureaucrat in a glass cell.
Yeah.
It's the conception of evil in traditional morality is different, right? It's that person who John Galt is evil because he's like the most selfish man there is, and
Yes.
he'll ruin other people if they're against him. And I don't know, there's like her conception is different, so it makes sense that if Nietzsche views, you know, like it makes sense that there'll be overlap basically, and there'll be points that don't overlap, like
Yeah.
force others. But that's the appeal, right? Like suddenly the good can have that emotional appeal because it's effective, it's powerful, and part of
Yes.
it overlaps with traditional evil.
Yeah. Traditional evil. The Christian sense of evil.
Right.
What's evil for a Christian?
Right.
And Nietzsche stood against that same conception too.
Right. So
And
yeah,
you spoke like
yeah,
these
sorry.
social critiques of things like that the nature of Christianity has made our society into what it is as we know today, morally speaking.
Right. So that yeah, it makes sense. There's the overlap.
But a profound difference on reason. They profoundly disagree about reason. But other than that, I mean, she does have a lot of overlap. Stylistically, at least.
Well, I really like her style, so that's more you just keep motivating me to read all these people, but I feel myself intellectually stretched too thin. It's hard for me. Look how much time I spent just on Ayn Rand as well. So
yeah,
and I'm still not
just
really
stay focused on.
yeah.
If you think you'll get there eventually.
I'll do
Like there's so much Aristotle I want to read like right now, but I can only read so fast. And I'd get overwhelmed too.
Let me jump actually, because this is relevant to Ito. This passage in Ito, I'll let you read it, and then maybe we can finish on this to discuss it.
Yeah. Yeah, I got it.
Yeah. So does this actually relate to traditional conception of evil? Because traditional conception of evil perceives it as evil is perceived as a force. It's a positive. It's not a negative. It is positive in the sense of it is a thing. It is a being. Like
yeah.
But in her conception, I think it's the absence of the good. And even Aristotle, I know he's got a quote that says something like, "To miss the mark is easy, to hit it is hard. There are many ways to fail. There's only one way to succeed." Right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so in her conception, evil is simply missing the mark. It's anything but hitting the mark. And therefore it's not a force. It's the negation of that force. And so do you think this era of I don't know if it's an error in conceptualizing morality, but like that making, what is it, reification?
Reification of the zero.
Is evil in traditional morality, could I say it is reified erroneously?
Yes, I would say Rand would say that too.
Ah,
I
okay.
think I know a passage related to that. I'll find it for you for next time. Something I was reading just recently, so I'll find it quickly.
From who?
But it's in it's a book about Ayn Rand by Chris Gabara. It's
Okay.
about her Rand's Russian influences,
Ah, yes, you
philosophical
mentioned.
influences, which is very informative. I've learned a lot, but also, yeah, I'll show you what I found.
Yeah,
But
you
yeah,
brought it up.
reification of the zero. Rand does mention it somewhere.
I forgot you brought it up in Remember you brought it up in relation to Dostoevsky. You talked about the wide-ranging integrations that she
Yes,
makes are similar to other Russians.
yes.